Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
Welcome. Hello, everybody. Welcome very much to the Science for Action Evening 2024. Welcome also to everybody who's watching us online. My name is Carola Best. I will guide you through this evening on behalf of BMBF, which is the German Federal Ministry for Education and Research. And we will start with welcoming remarks from BMBF delivered by Dominic Larue, who is Policy Officer in BMBF's Division for Global Change and Climate Research.
Good evening. My name is Dominic Larue, Policy Officer at the German Ministry of Education and Research. I'm very sorry that I cannot join you in person today, and I send my regards from Bonn to Baku. This is the second Science for Action evening we host, and after the successful launch of the format last year in Dubai, I'm especially pleased to welcome you all for another round of exciting exchange directly at the science policy interface. Science for Action evenings are all about providing policymakers, researchers, and civil society representatives an opportunity to talk, to listen, and to learn from each other. This dialogue is important because research and innovation are fundamental pillars of fact-based policymaking and climate action. Our research strategy regarding climate change, therefore, is not only to broaden the knowledge base, but also to deliver options for implementation. We all know, in order to achieve climate neutrality, we need to implement transformation at all levels, and we have to do this very quickly. Difficult choices have to be made, and optimal solutions are not yet known everywhere. That is where we need further research and development. Let me give you a few examples of what our ministry is doing in order to support effective climate solutions. In sectors of the basic materials industry, such as steel and iron production, the cement industry, or the chemical industry, process-related greenhouse gas emissions are virtually unavoidable using current technologies. Therefore, we are funding the development of innovative processes aiming at significant reduction of greenhouse gases. In addition to deep and rapid decarbonization, we also have to adapt to already existing impacts of climate change, such as flooding or extreme heat. The severe health impacts from extreme heat, for example, will intensify in the future. Children and elderly, as well as individuals with pre-existing conditions, are at increased risk during heat waves. One of our junior research groups is developing a risk prediction tool that can be implemented as a weather warning system. It allows targeting high-risk groups according to health-relevant weather conditions, so they are aware of risks at an early stage and can take preventive action. Finally, the best mitigation and adaptation measures and technologies will fail without the necessary financial support. At COP29, this topic takes center stage. With enormous sums being shifted and redirected, the financial sector plays an important role in implementing climate action. The German government funds research on the sustainable development of the financial sector in order to achieve a better understanding of its role. Our funding activities aim to contribute the best available science to society. Right now, with negotiations focusing on the implementation of past decisions, with new NDCs being published that have to stand the test against reality, and with the work on the upcoming IPCC reports having started, now is a good time to talk about how to identify the most effective options. I hope that the exchange tonight can help in shaping a research agenda that will move us towards achieving the Paris goals. I'm very grateful to welcome so many renowned experts and look forward to fruitful discussions. I now wish all of you a productive exchange. Please enjoy the food and drinks during the breakout groups. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much to Dominic for these nice words. Now, what are we aiming for with this event? He just said, with global greenhouse gas emissions still on the rise and the impacts taking their toll, the urgency is clear. And the sixth assessment report of the IPCC emphasized the world has to act quickly. We can just simply not meddle around anymore. And therefore, tonight, we focus on what research can tell us about what works and what does not work regards to climate action. I now am very grateful to the chair of the IPCC, Professor Jim Skea, that he honors the Science for Action evening again this year, like last year, and he will give us some background on the findings of the IPCC reports past and planned on what makes climate action effective. So without further ado, Jim, please, the stage is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for paying me the compliment of asking me back again. I hope I can actually justify that. Now, I'm going to focus most of my remarks on mitigation, because that's what I know about as the former co-chair of Working Group 3. But let me say just a few things about adaptation at the end as well. Now, I think one of the big conclusions, and a very obvious one from the sixth assessment report, is that we are way off track in terms of putting in place policies and measures that would allow the long-term temperature goal to be achieved. And there are two gaps there. It's not a single gap. There is an emissions gap and there is an implementation gap. And what I'm going to argue is that IPCC actually said more about the emissions gap than it said about the implementation gap. And that is, will kind of be the theme of the remarks. So let's take the emissions gap first of all, and that is the difference between the near to medium term ambitions as represented by the NDCs and where we would need to be to put us on a pathway to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And I think we were quite clear about what needed to be done in the high-level indicators and benchmarks. It wasn't only the emission levels, we explored emission scenarios, and we could set kind of benchmarks for things like the deployment of renewable energy, avoided deforestation, energy efficiency, electrification, and other measures in agriculture and land use. And I think actually the reports have produced information there that is usable by the negotiations here at the UNFCCC. I would say that was less the case for the implementation gap, which is the difference between the near to medium term ambitions and the detailed policies and specific actions that would allow the NDCs to be met. And there we get into the issue, the two-word phrase that appears in the spec for this session: what works? And it's a very important question. Now, I remember in a couple of cycles ago in IPCC, when we used the phrase policy evaluation, it did not go down well with some governments because it sounded like you were going to mark government score sheets. And it didn't really come across that what it was really about was lesson learning from the kind of policies that are put in place, where we can judge which ones are effective, which ones are less effective, to how we can advance policy. And a lot of sensitivities about that I think have calmed down as we've got a better understanding of what ex post evaluation of projects might deliver. Now, one of the things we did conclude in the sixth cycle, in the last IPCC report, was that we had avoided gigatons worth of greenhouse gas emissions because of policies that had already been put in place. And there were various methodologies for doing that. And I've deliberately said gigatons and not put any numbers attached to it, because there were a number of different methodologies and approaches used. But they were all in the, the small, 10% of global emissions kind of level was the kind of brackets for them. But I think what is much more needed now is attention to more specific policies that have been deployed at national levels or at supranational levels like in the EU, to understand, looking backwards, what have they achieved? What were the lessons that have been learned from actually putting them in place? And one of the things I was pleased to hear, we had a meeting with ICCN, the International Climate Council's network, earlier this week, and told us about a database that they were considering putting together about specific policy interventions that had been done to kind of list the measure of the successes. And that's exactly the kind of thing we need, because IPCC doesn't do new research. It can only assess what's out there already. And that is the very kind of mine of information, I think, that we can make effective use of. I notice our German colleagues are very interested in that agenda. Jan Minks at the Mercator, soon to be Peak, you put together a conference on what works in Berlin earlier this year, which was extremely successful, I think, in carrying forward this agenda. Now, I should say that, we are also interested in this at IPCC. At the next plenary session of IPCC, I will be introducing a proposal for a workshop which is tentatively called Novel and Extended Means of Assessment, which has a number of different purposes, including how we could use AI, machine learning, etc., to cut through the exponentially growing literature we have on climate change and climate change action. But it will also attempt to think about methods of accessing practitioner knowledge about what works on the ground. It's not just about getting to peer-reviewed academic articles. We do need to move into what is called the grey literature. So that's where we are. I think we've done a far better job on emissions gaps than implementation gaps. That's where there's bigger knowledge gaps there, and that's where I'd like to go. Now, in terms of mitigation versus adaptation, we have I think we have further to go on adaptation than we do on mitigation, to tell you the truth, which is why I've said so little about it, because we know less about it and where some of the gaps are. So the conclusions in the 6th assessment report was that adaptation efforts are fragmented, incremental, and focused more on planning than implementation, which echoes exactly the same message that I've given about mitigation there. We really need to understand what happens on the ground. So the ambitions of myself, and I think all of the co-chairs of the 3 working groups in IPCC for the coming cycle, are to make the findings more actionable as we will deliver this report towards the end of the decade of action. I hope the 2030s aren't a decade of inaction, I should say. There's always a risk in doing that. But that's our ambition, more actionable information, and I think more attention to the implementation issue is something that will carry us forward successfully. And with that, I'm not sure if I even used my 10 minutes, but I've come to the end.
Thank you so much, Jim. It was a pretty perfect landing regarding the time. Thank you so much. This provides us with an excellent backdrop for the discussions later on. I'm sorry to hear that Jim has to move on to other events and due to obligations and cannot participate in the discussions, but thank you again very, very much for this input, Jim. So what we want to do later on is discuss with all of you about effective measures in different areas of climate action. And that would be mitigation, adaptation, finance, and inclusivity as an enabling factor for effective measures. So each topic will be introduced by 2 experts, one from the policy realm and one from research. And after that, after these inputs, we will go into these breakout groups. You see the chairs arranged in circle-like shapes to enable the discussion later on. So with that, I would like to ask Elias Spiekermann and Neil Grant to the stage. Elias Spiekermann is Senior Policy Officer in the Directorate General for Climate Action of the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action in Germany. And he will give us a short introduction into what works and what does not from side of the policy perspective.
Thanks a lot, it works. Good evening, and great that so many people are here at this late hour. I would like to give a short introduction from the policy side, or at least from the inside of the administration, behind the politics. My world is very much focused on the energy and climate nexus internationally, so sorry if I don't cover all the important topics around this when it comes to mitigation. And I would like to argue that we are trying to work science-based as far as possible. We are facing for sure different goals that we are trying to achieve, and science is one of them, but at least we're trying our best, and I'm looking forward for being challenged on this. But I would like to give some examples on what we're working and how this is kind of science-based or science based on our evidence based. The first important point that we started to work on just like 3 years ago in the new German government back then is methane. Science is pretty clear that methane is one of the important drivers of global warming. And there are some evidence that it's around the contribution of methane to global warming is bigger than 30%. So this is a very important topic that hasn't been discussed from the energy side a lot. So we tried, at least in the international sphere, to come up with some answers to this problem. And for now, in the division or in the DG we're working in, we're trying to support the science base, the database on the emissions, on energy related methane emissions globally. And we're trying to work with countries on the ground to tackle those emissions. And this work is, I would argue, very much based on the scientific evidence, and we have limited resources for sure in the administration. So we looked where we can have the most impact, and methane is definitely one of the items on the list. A second point, looking at the IPCC sixth assessment report, is a beautiful graph showing the different mitigation options and their mitigation potentials at different costs until 2030. And my own policy summary from this beautiful graph is, or was, that we very much need to focus on renewable energies and the reduction of energy demand and energy savings. And this kind of provoked us to work on those both topics, which ended also up in the last GST. We call them the global goals on energy efficiency and renewables, so the tripling and the doubling. And this is very much guiding our work at the moment. We are looking at the different enablers to drive the savings in the energy demand and the renewable energies development, such as finance, regulation, and skills. And this is hopefully both addressing the implementation and the ambition gap. And third, and then I'm finishing, and this is the most difficult, I guess, is the transition away from fossil fuels. This is also what we very much learned from science, but we all know it's high on the priority list on our side, and we're trying our best to get along on this very important agenda. And for sure at COP29, we're trying to develop all those 3 items. It's very difficult, as all you know, an experience on an everyday basis here in Baku. but we're hoping to at least do some steps. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elias. And I directly hand over to Neil Grant. He is Senior Climate and Energy Analyst at Climate Analytics, which is a global climate science and policy institute, and he will challenge those.
Maybe slightly. Yes, thanks for inviting me to be here at this event. I'm going to structure my remarks first off slightly about some context setting. I'm actually not going to speak so much to these slides because already I think the talks have spurred some different thoughts. So I'm going to do a slight bit of context setting and then talk about 3 areas where science can help drive rapid emissions reductions and hold the global community accountable to those reductions. So first off, where are we at? The latest emissions gap report has just been published showing that the gap in 2030 and into 2035 is still as large as ever. So when we talk about what works, we also need to talk about what isn't working, and clearly at a collective global level, ambition raising is not happening fast enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and cut emissions at the rate that the science is telling us. But at the same time, if we look at the context, we are in a fundamentally different place in 2024 to where we were even when the AR6 report concluded, particularly around renewables and about the changing context there in their cost reductions and the potential that provides us. And again, the emissions gap report finds that there is still sufficient mitigation potential to close the gap in both 2030 and in 2035. Which leads me on to my remarks on how science and mitigation can help us. First off, I think we need to think much more about which technologies have worked in the past to drive mitigation reductions. And those are technologies which are modular, which are scalable, which are low complexity, and can be deployed in many different areas. So wind, solar, batteries, they sit at that edge of the technology characterization matrices. We need to be honest that technologies which are engineering intense, complex, require customization in different places, may play some limited role, but they are never going to scale at the pace and receive the cost reductions at the pace of wind and solar. And so that means we do need to continue to update our modeling to capture the potential of wind and solar and see reduced levels of CCS and CDR. And we're seeing that already coming through in the models. We'll see more of that. The second point is about land use. The Climate Action Tracker has just released some first 2035 NDC asks, including land use emissions. And land use is really an important part, as we've already heard from others. Ending deforestation is a key element in keeping limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. But we also know that the scientific accounting methods for capturing land use emissions differ to the methods used by countries in reporting. And this sounds like a technical issue, but it actually has significant real-world implications, with the national inventories accounting for land use emissions as a global sink, while the models suggest that it's a global source. Now, once you account for that discrepancy, global net zero dates are pulled forwards by 5 years. So that's a really significant change in global benchmarks. If we're going to track progress on the basis of country inventories, then we need to move faster and we need to move further. I'll close with one third remark, which is what we've already heard a bit from Elias on the real importance of energy efficiency and demand-side action. I think the science has shown very clearly there. There's some great segments in the AR6 showing the real potential for demand-side action, and also the highlight that demand-side actions come with a huge range of co-benefits, often beyond those of supply-side action. So that's not saying we don't need significant supply-side action, but science is really highlighting the significant benefits of demand shifts and action on energy efficiency. I think there's a lot of room to capture that better in the scenario modeling to inform policy assessments. But that is the third area where I think the science can help us. I'll close my remarks there.
Thank you very much for those insights, which will provide an excellent basis for the discussions later. So I'll just ask you to join your group already, and I'll ask the next. This is your applause. Thank you. And I'd like to ask the next 2 experts on stage which is Britta, Horstmann, and Richard Klein. Yeah, just wherever you want. Richard Klein from Stockholm Environment Institute. His research focuses on the role of adaptation in global climate policy, how it can be integrated with other policy priorities, and the institutional challenges that come with that. And he was one of the co-authors of the IPCC's technical guidelines may I say, way back in 1994. Yes, and he will give the science perspective on questions regarding effective measures in adaptation. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks a lot, Carola. I've got a few slides and I don't have much time, so I'll try to go through them like a German ICE, like they used to be. So when talking about climate change adaptation in the IPCC, I think it's good to look back at where we started. We've got 6 assessment reports and a number of special reports. The first one didn't actually have adaptation. There was some talk about adaptation in Working Group 3 at the time, which was about response measures. So there was a working group that dealt with adaptation and mitigation at once, but it was mostly mitigation. In Working Group, in the second assessment report, the structure was changed, and Working Group 2 was then about impact, vulnerabilities, and adaptation. But it was really mostly about impact assessment, and adaptation was a bit of an afterthought in some of the sectors that were being discussed, including coastal zones and human health and agriculture. Then when we move on, there is an increasing attention is given to adaptation, but interestingly always in a different way. The framing of adaptation in the IPCC assessment reports changes every report, which is in a way interesting. It perhaps also reflects the state of science at the time, but it also is a problem because unlike, for example, mitigation or the work that Working Group 1 does, it makes it very difficult to sort of build on the work of the previous reports and assess the progress, both in the science but also in the implementation. So I won't go into much more detail. Just like to have a quick plug to a report we did a few years ago, identifying sort of the progress in adaptation research and how it evolved from a very descriptive kind of research, trying to come up with concepts of adaptation, to something that was more normative, identifying the policy questions and then focusing on implementation. And in that report there's, I think, quite a useful table, perhaps also for the IPCC and preparing for the scoping meeting, with the kind of questions that are being asked in the different generations of adaptation research and the priorities that we identified at the time for descriptive, normative, policy and implementation questions. Now back to where we are now, and this is purely sort of my own brain dump here, based on my own experience in IPCC and where adaptation science is, but also where the UNFCCC process is heading with adaptation. 3 challenges that I identify. The first one, and as we heard from Jim, it needs to be actionable, but then the question is actionable for whom? There are different audiences for the IPCC reports, and that includes different audiences for the IPCC adaptation assessment. And some of them are perhaps more interested in problem-oriented, and others are more interested in solution-oriented assessment approaches. And typically the IPCC has done both. It's a bit of a mixed bag, which isn't necessarily a problem, but perhaps we need to focus more towards solution-oriented approaches right now. There are questions that the assessments are meant to address that are sometimes poorly defined, coming from users, coming from the UNFCCC process, for example. What is climate resilient development, for example? Other questions are very straightforward, but empirically very difficult to address. What is the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation so far, for example? And then we have the third challenge, the analytical and socio-political contexts for climate risk and adaptation that are evolving rapidly, making adaptation assessment increasingly complex. An important conclusion from AR6 was that climate risks are increasingly complex, compound and cascading, thereby also making adaptation itself increasingly difficult. And that's, of course, a challenge not only for the assessment, but also for the users. Then finally, some priorities that I would like to perhaps also give towards the breakout groups that we have. There is a need to assess both problem-oriented and solution-oriented, in other words, research on adaptation, the process of adaptation, how does adaptation work, and why doesn't it work, but also be much more explicit about research for adaptation. What are the options and when could they be implemented and under what conditions? Assess adaptation progress. That was something that I think the 6th assessment report could have done better. It would have perhaps also helped to better inform the global stocktake, the first one that finished last year. But then, of course, also the barriers to that progress. As Jim said, adaptation is fragmented, it's incremental, and it's not. In fact, we're actually creating more risk than we are reducing by adaptation at the moment, and that is largely because of either ignoring the risks or through maladaptation, which is perhaps well-intended, but causing increasing risks possibly to others. So instead of reducing risk, we are redistributing risk or shifting the risk onto others. And that leads to the third priority, which is to be really explicit about issues of equity and justice in adaptation. Working Group 3 on mitigation has done that, I think, from the very beginning. The issue of equity and justice in mitigation, of course, is you know, a long-standing one and is important in IPCC. It is increasingly important to talk about adaptation or just resilience, if you like, through an equity lens. And then finally, the IPCC technical guidelines. The original ones were from 1994, 2 years ago. The Global Goal and Adaptation negotiations came with an invitation to the IPCC to consider updating the 1994 technical guidelines. The IPCC has considered it and has agreed to do that as part of its 7th assessment cycle. I think this is an important priority, potentially. At the same time, there are so many guidances. The objective of these guidelines would be very different from the ones in 1994, and it is a very politically sensitive issue. I think we'll leave it to that, and talking about politics, over to Britta.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And we'll hand over to Britta Horstmann. She is an advisor to the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, is member of the EU negotiation team to the UNFCCC, and co-chair of the Adaptation Committee. Britta.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share some reflections, but I prefer to do so in my personal capacity because that inspires, I think, the thinking and brainstorming. I think I won't make the ICE. You almost did the former speed, I think, in former times. I feel like a local train after a week of very intense negotiations, I have to say. I think what I try to do in my presentation briefly is to build on what you say and try to zoom in on the opportunities for enhancing science policy, the science policy interface and the opportunities that are there based on the negotiation process where we currently are, and to give you an overview of what we are discussing in the different rooms. So looking at the different rooms that we currently have on the agenda on adaptation, which is on, if you look to the right-hand side, on national adaptation plans, LDCs matters. We had two, one on the adaptation committee, and I didn't list one, that's the Nairobi work program, a network of 450 stakeholders, which might be of interest to several of you here, but we don't negotiate that at the COP. I had the impression, and then we have, of course, the global goal on adaptation, and related to that, the UAE framework for global climate resilience that decided on 11 targets overall. And related to that, we are in the middle of looking at the potential of having indicators to that. So the UAE emblem work program and indicators. And my impression was the two main questions that cut across all of these is how to enhance adaptation action and support, particularly with the formulation and implementation of NAPs, particularly in LDC circumstances, but of course it's also a question for the AC in providing technical advice to parties. That is also the overall ambition in the end of the UAE framework for global climate resilience and to enhance action and support and prioritize there. The other big question is how to assess progress on adaptation, and that is a question in the NAP rooms. We do have the assessment of NAP progress that happens, and of course that's the big question now as part of the UAE BLM work program in indicators. But both questions actually also play a role in other rooms. The last one on progress is also part of the enhanced transparency framework. We have decisions there on how we monitor progress there, for example, with a view to finance, but also the GST, we have provisions of how we are supposed to do so. And the finance rooms, also observation and research, to highlight some. Zooming in a bit on the opportunity, to illustrate, I illustrated the legal complexity, but we also have a huge complexity when it comes to the technical levels. So just to illustrate the 4 targets around the policy cycle, you don't have to read all the details, but this is something that countries shall do until, or are asked to do until 2030. And for example, all countries are asked to have impact and vulnerability and risk assessments that are up to date and inform the national NAP formulation, one of the big targets. In addition to that, we parties also for the first time decided on priorities related to 7 themes. And why am I highlighting this? Because the knowledge needs that come from this process have usually been diverse, because adaptation is a context-specific and topic. But these 4 dimensional targets and the themes also form as a kind of priority with a view to the implementation, but of course also the knowledge needs that stem from that. And that's why it's so important, I think. Zooming in again then on some of the opportunities, very concrete ones where we where we could improve the science policy interface here. Are the targets of the UAE framework. I mentioned risk assessment. We have observations on the one hand side and the last mile, but who takes care of what happens in the middle? What happens when WMO delivered the data and then the researcher comes? So how does that translate into the information the end user needs? And that falls with between the chairs, I would say, in Germany. So who has the mandate to do that? And because it's to a certain extent also a global public good related question, because it falls into the responsibility of several actors. There, I have the impression the science policy interface needs more attention, and we need overall, we need, as Jim already highlighted, action and solution-oriented research. So what needs to be done so that countries can achieve that target? And on top of what Jim said, I think summarizing and aggregating also the status quo of information that we have, yet in a user-oriented manner, and finding the right formats of doing so. I think that is also important, and that is what partly is lacking, because it makes a difference whether you'd like to provide information for a negotiator, a decision maker, or a farmer on the ground, but the formats of translating that science-related knowledge then into what decision makers need there is a huge gap and lag, I would say. And the second big thing is to consider the ideas of subsidiarity or the division of labor. If you look at the themes, we do have the SDGs, we do have WMO. So what is it actually that we should do here in this process versus other things that others can deal with in a better manner? So the second potential opportunity is some are suggesting an IPCC task force to follow up on a 2030 target in this week at the moment. Is that useful? Should we have something like that? Is it at all realistic? I have my opinions on that, but that's some question we can discuss in the breakout groups. And how can we then use also existing institutions? Of course, another important topic, transformative adaptation. There are huge concerns, and developing countries are concerned that they haven't even advanced on incremental adaptation. So how do the two things go together, and what does science say for practitioners on the ground? Is transformative adaptation, is it an opportunity for leapfrogging? So the understanding of what it means on the ground is it is initial stages, and more work is needed there. Richard already alluded to and I finish in a minute, the IPCC guidelines. They had also been part of this decision process, and we decided here to invite the IPCC. And indeed, I have to say, many questions the benefits of updating the guidelines, and I think many had hoped that the IPCC plenary would not agree on that. And also in the adaptation committee, we had considered it, but in the end came to the conclusion that there is already a plethora of guidance out there, and what I personally would have preferred to see is an interface between science and practitioners, so those that use the guidance and linking that to new research and thereby improving these guidelines over time, just as an example. So we zoomed in on what happens here in the process, and what we would like to do in the breakout group is that we zoom in again also then on another concrete opportunity, which is then the role of the IPCC in relation to some of the questions that arise from this process, and what the benefits and opportunities are for the upcoming IPCC work, but also the risks and challenges in informing, for example, questions as those that I've raised. And so yeah, we invite you to come to our group and huddle.
Thank you so much. I'm sure people are looking forward to discussing this with you. So I'll ask you to your group, and we'll ask the next, please. Thank you, and I'll ask the next experts on stage, please. That would be for the topic of finance, Hendrikje, Reich and Thomas Wencker. And we'll start with the scientific perspective again with Thomas Wencker. He's Senior Evaluator for Evaluations on Development Cooperation at the German Institute for Development Evaluation, short DEval. And his current work focuses on climate change mitigation, development cooperation in fragile contexts, patterns of aid allocation, and state capacity building. Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to present some research and evaluation that just recently came out on the topic of climate change mitigation through development cooperation. So I think the main story here is that development cooperation can make a big difference with regard to climate change mitigation, but for that to happen, it's not only important to look at the amount of climate finance, but also about how climate finance is distributed. So I'm going to make 4 main points regarding the transparency, distribution, alignment, and the impact of climate finance. So first of all, when it comes to climate finance, we all know that stated needs are not met yet. But what we did in the evaluation was to look closely at the reporting, and there are basically 2 more problems. So one is over-reporting. So what we did is apply machine learning approaches to go through hundreds and thousands of project descriptions and combine that with qualitative evidence to assess whether it really becomes clear from the reporting that reported climate finance is actually mitigation relevant or adaptation relevant. And what we do find is that about a third, maybe a fourth, when it comes to mitigation finance, is over-reported. The RIO markers, that's hugely important, is higher than we would expect from the description of the project. Then another problem is that a large amount of mitigation finance comes in the form of loans. That's not in itself a problem, but it's reported at face value rather than the grant equivalent. So figures are quite high, so it's very important what you report there. When it comes to the distribution of mitigation ODA, that's a very tricky question from a normative perspective, but also from the perspective of effectiveness. So climate change mitigation is a global public good, so it doesn't really make a difference where emissions are reduced. So that would make sense that mitigation ODA goes to places where mitigation is cost effective, But that would probably also mean that it doesn't go to the least developed countries where it's important to put them on low emission pathways. So what we did is we looked at the distribution of mitigation ODA from Germany, and what we found is that more developed countries receive mitigation ODA less frequently. So we conclude from that the distribution of German ODA focuses on socioeconomic need, but we didn't find such thing for the mitigation potential. Third point is alignment. So what we did here is we looked at ODA commitments that go to sectors with corresponding targets in the NDCs and compared that with ODA commitments to sectors without corresponding targets before and after NDCs were published. So these are conditional sectoral targets. And the cutoff is basically 2015 for these 2015 for these goals. And what we would expect is after 2015 for the orange line to go up, because at that point in time it becomes obvious what the sectoral targets are, and we don't find such a thing. So, and my last point on impact. So what we found in our evaluation is that ODA that has mitigation as a principal objective does mitigate emissions from a very broad perspective. At the same time, we do not find the same for ODA with mitigation as a significant objective, so KLM1 markers. That might be due to overreporting, for instance. And for total ODA, we find that emissions increase, which is something we would expect. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And with that, we hand over to Hendrikje Reich. She's Policy Officer in the Division for Financing International Climate Action in Development Banks, and Sustainable Financing in the German Federal Office for External Affairs, and member of the EU negotiation team to the UNFCCC. Hendrikje, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. So I would take you a bit more to the policy world of the negotiations and the NCQG and all the whole world of climate finance. It was actually great to see your presentation, because I must admit that I'm lately not managing to read any scientific studies, because we just don't have the time anymore, because we are the climate finance agenda is very stretched. So that means when I saw the graph there, that we actually don't see the yellow-orange line going up, I find that very striking. I think that is definitely something that we need to look into, and that then goes into our planning. So how are we allocating money? What are we doing? What kind of programs are we programming, and what does that mean like for the implementation of our climate finance and our ODA? Because it definitely should go the other way around. I think we started, climate finance is still quite a new field, so we started with the 100 billion goal in 2009 when it first was agreed, and I think since then we do have a steep learning curve. We now finally met the 100 billion goal in 2022. We do these kind of progress reports where we are trying to understand how we all together are implementing the climate finance. And now for the first time at the Standing Committee of Finance, in that progress report, we also try to capture better the meaningful impact and transparency. And that was quite difficult to look into that, because of course in our climate finance, we all implement through our channels. So we make use of bilateral climate finance. We work through the international climate funds. We make use of the MDB. So we do have a lot of different channels implementing climate finance. They all do have the different monitoring schemes running. And so it's quite difficult for us to get a good understanding on how impactful we are. And this makes it then also difficult to reflect in this political process what are the needs. So I think in the field of climate finance, we do lack research, but we also do lack research to the topics that we are then focused on in our work, and we do need a strong policy orientation. I think it's more along the line of what Britta already said. So, and we saw that now in the negotiation process on the NCQG. Of course, we looked into studies, but it's not the peer-reviewed paper. I'm very sorry for that, but it's not the peer-reviewed paper. It's a policy paper that gets out at the right time. So timing matters a lot, and it needs to be short, so no one will read a long paper. This year, also with the G20 Task Force Klima, we produced a lot of reports. I doubt that anyone really read them. So we need conclusions, we need executive summaries. Of course, you need to have valid science behind all that, but it needs to be prepared for policymakers to easily being able to assess the key messages and to then have time, if needed, to go to the background research to pull out the paper, the hard science, so to say. And it really needs to be out on time. So we have now been waiting for the HLEC report, for example, to get new numbers on the assessments, to get a better understanding on what is needed for the NCQG as well. It took them quite some time to get the numbers out, and they now publish the report right now here at the conference, which is great. But for us to react as a policymaker, it's a bit too late. So we need it up front. It would have been great to have it out for pre-COP. It's still great to have it out now, but then it would have been more helpful. So timing matters a lot. If I come back to the work that we are doing at the Standing Committee of Finance, and there we do have the flagship report of the biennial assessment that looks into the broader trends, and that is actually a report that we as EU are also building quite a lot on when we are thinking about what kind of progress, tracking, or transparency reporting we would like to see on the broader dimension on the NCQG. But the Standing Committee of Finance does not have like a mandate to look into raw data. They can only work on existing reports, similar as the IPCC, but it needs not to be, it can be whatever kind of literature, so we are happy to take any inputs. And this is relevant when we now, like in our EU vision of the NCQG decision, we do see a lot of qualitative information coming in because quality of climate finance matters. And that we clearly saw also with the 100 billion report. It's about access, it's about gender responsiveness, it's about understanding what are the barriers for implementing climate action. It's about the barriers that are hindering countries to access funds. And there are a lot of different causes. But to be able to reflect the progress that we are making, we then also need studies working on these kind of elements that we do find in the decision text. If we don't have any research on that, then we don't have a good understanding if we are making any progress or not. So if you're looking for a topic for new research, please look into the decision text of the NCQG once we have it agreed. I'm very hopeful that we managed to get it agreed here at the COP. So it might inspire some further work, and then I'm really looking forward to read the executive summary and the 10 key messages. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this plea for concise and timely research results and for your input. And this is your applause now, and you can go back. Yeah. So we will get to the fourth and last of our input teams, and I would like to ask Marie-Claire Graf to the stage, and Debora Ley will join us via Zoom. Hi, Debbie. We will start off with Marie-Claire. She's an environmental justice activist, former Swiss climate negotiator, and co-founder of the Youth Negotiators Academy. And she will give us her perspective on the importance of inclusiveness for designing effective climate action.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, the microphone works. While we see a lot of general evidence on the importance of inclusion, diversity, and participation, I think it's quite important to notice that this process here is lagging behind. While we see increased participation opportunities, we are still really have like a gap here. And while we have seen in the last round, for example, of the NDCs, some of the countries have been taking a very participatory approach. I really hope that in the next cycle of the NDCs we can drastically advance on the participation and inclusion elements. Also here in the COP itself, we are still also seeing that we are lagging behind when it comes to the inclusion, specifically also for delegations with very small numbers of delegates being here who cannot even cover all the topics. So I think the topic of inclusion is very relevant for the process itself, but also when we talk about the scientific element, and I was very happy that it was already covered before here, because what we see quite often that the scientific evidence is quite far from the negotiating rooms, and I think we as a community have to get better at translating this, making it accessible, but also really tailor it to the policymakers and their realities. So we at the Youth Negotiators Academy, we are training young negotiators who are joining their party delegations. We have been training over 300 negotiators this year, and it was a very robust training actually in the start on the latest findings of the IPCC. And I was unfortunately quite shocked to see how many delegates have never even considered reading the AR6 or also the policymaker summary. And also, like, once we presented it, how still so many questions were there, and once they are now here, how still we see a gap on translating the latest available science to their country position, to their priorities, and then into negotiation text. And if we want to have evidence-based policy outcomes here at the COP, I think we need as a community to do a better job in really bringing this inclusion forward. While I have been also exchanging with some of the young negotiators here on the topic of inclusion, we also train a lot of indigenous young people who are joining their delegation, and I think they have been bringing forward a very strong point on that the current scientific metrics are lagging behind to value and appreciate the contribution of traditional knowledge, of kind of the stewards of the lands, of the biodiversity. So I think, again, we as a community have to do a better job when we talk about inclusion, to not kind of just appropriate and bring in indigenous knowledge into a Western scientific approach, but allow the variety and, again, the inclusion and diversity of metrics to exist and coexist, and hopefully also support us on how the scientific evidence itself can actually be better. Another one, when we talk about inclusion, and I've been also chatting with the colleagues of the IPCC, it actually already starts that within the IPCC panels there is a lack of representation. We all know that there's a lack of representation when it comes to countries from the Global South and representation of women in these panels, but also of young people, especially young people from marginalized communities. So again, there, I think we have to really start from the bottom, where the participation and inclusion can happen. We have beautiful examples, and I know the IPCC is also working very hard and other scientific bodies to really drive this inclusion. But again, there is also a gap which we definitely should approach. So there's quite a lot to do, and maybe I'm just ending on the point that even if we have these inclusive processes, I think it's also of us to allow the inclusion to really happen. We see a lot of power dynamics, especially in the last 48 hours in the rooms of the negotiations. So how can we also allow voices from more marginalized communities, indigenous perspective, to not only be presented and applauded to as an inspirational point of view, but actually that they are coming into the rooms and into the decisions for actually supporting and guiding us. And I think there we also have a lot to do on how we are shifting our own mindsets towards allowing a diversity of perspectives to really inform our decision making. Overall, I think I'm very hopeful, very glad. This year we have been bringing here over 150 youth negotiators who are part of their governmental delegations. I'm also very happy, as we are in the German Pavilion, to say that for the first time Germany also has young negotiators as part of their delegation team, which I'm very pleased about.
Thank you, Marie-Claire. we'll hand over to Debora Ley on Zoom. She's Economic Affairs Officer of the Energy and Natural Resource Unit of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, short CEPAL, and she was lead author for the IPCC 6 assessment report in the Working Group 2 contribution on impacts, vulnerability and adaptation, and the lead author of the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. They're also focusing on adaptation, sustainable development, and renewable energy. And Debora, please share with us your scientific perspective on the importance of inclusiveness.
Yes, thank you very much, Carola. Really, really sorry and frustrated to not be there in person today. So I think that the topic of inclusivity really goes to the heart of leaving no one behind and how do we achieve it. So I wanted to have my remarks on how do you do that in part of research, but also on our role as researchers. So I'll start by saying that in the 6th assessment cycle, starting from the special report on global warming at 1.5 degrees C, we started the feasibility assessment, the multidimensional feasibility assessment that looked at more than the economic and technological dimensions of feasibility, because we were asked to consider sustainable development and poverty alleviation. So within that, we have a social-cultural dimensions that has indicators such as social-cultural acceptability, intergenerational equity, or gender equity. And just as a clarification that we don't consider those the only types of equity, but those were the only types of equity for which we had enough evidence to carry off the assessment. Just as an example, in SR 1.5, even though we wanted to include gender equity as an indicator of mitigation and adaptation options, there wasn't enough evidence. But there was, by the time AR6 came around, both for working groups 2 and 3. And what this exercise highlighted is that there are significant barriers there for both the feasibility and effectiveness of the implementation of both mitigation and adaptation options. But it also highlights the importance that mitigation and adaptation can't be separate, because many times we overlook the synergies and trade-offs that happen between them. So for example, how some mitigation efforts can really increase the vulnerability of vulnerable populations. Just as a brief example, when we talk about mining of critical minerals for energy transition. So this feasibility assessment has grown a little, has started moving beyond the IPCC. And for example, a researcher has already started implementing it in Nicaragua with rural indigenous populations. So we hope to see more of that research soon. Inclusivity also comes within the concept of climate resilient development pathways. Especially when we talk about who is involved and how should people be involved. And that when we talk about people being at the center of climate action, and that each and every one of us has a role in deciding the pathways and in anything related to climate action, really, we're talking about how we include the most vulnerable and marginalized peoples, but what we focus on is not just that there needs to be an interaction, but the quality of those interactions and what it means to include other values and worldviews. So what does it mean really to include vulnerable people, and then how to do that shift of power dynamics? And it's not just listening, having a real dialogue, but how do we actually consider those concerns and needs and perceptions? So we're talking about indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, elderly people, other types of marginalization. And then that brings us to when we talk about climate action and whether it's mitigation or adaptation, we, for example, in the topic of disabilities, we're usually thinking about able-bodied people, like early warning systems that have a siren and are only audible, for example. Or when you say, well, you need to run to the nearest shelter, well, what happened with people that can't walk? So inclusivity goes throughout this realm. But I think when I said earlier that we also need to think about researchers, the same would apply. And that when we talk about inclusivity, I know in some groups, you can consider, well, we have gender parity, but just having gender parity does not necessarily mean inclusion when you don't think of this intersectionality. So it starts not only with the research, but it permeates the whole process. So when we talk about the quality of interactions, it should go both ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and get well soon.
Thank you.
So this concludes the part of inputs to the discussion groups. We've had a lot of input now. Thank you, Marie. So I would like to say thank you again to all the input givers. And this is the point where we also say goodbye to the audience in the live stream. Thank you so much for being with us up till now. And let's get into action. You've listened to a lot of input now, so we will start the discussion rounds. You will get to voice your own views, get to ask questions, get into an active exchange. We will have the group on mitigation with Elias and Neil here in this circle. We'll have the group for adaptation here with Richard and Britta.